Hello everyone, welcome to Internally Screening. Today we're going to be reviewing Satan's Slaves, 2017 Indonesian horror film directed by Joko Anwar. The story is centered around a family whose mother is fatally ill. At one time in her life she was a famous, well-loved singer, but she's now in this kind of throes of some kind of spooky demonic illness, or so it would appear. And it centers around the family dealing with the grief of her passing, but then also the haunting that may or may not be her. And lots of very spooky goings on happen around the house with the four children, all quite different age ranges. So you get like this kind of interesting family dynamic where the eldest sister, who is the main character, kind of is almost like a sort of secondary mother figure, and obviously through the passing of their actual mother essentially becomes that sort of surrogate figure. It's a sort of loose prequel to a 1980 film of the same name, which has some notoriety in Indonesia as this kind of cult video nasty type thing, where the release of it originally was quite sort of repressed by the governing bodies over there, and so the only way to get a hold of it was off like VHS tapes from Japan. And so it had a small but like really sort of dedicated following of sort of people that would go, have you heard of this film? It's like a film you can't get anywhere. So it has a kind of interesting heritage to it. So Rupert, I'm going to pass it to you. What did you make of Satan's Slaves?
Yeah, I mean, I'm taking that this film is almost nothing like what the original original Satan's Slaves is like, because it doesn't really have that vibe at all. It doesn't really feel like a video nasty type film, except for maybe in some elements that sort of come later in the film. What I found interesting about it is more that it was an incredibly modern feeling horror film. One of the biggest comparisons I was drawing to the film when we were watching it was Hereditary, because thematically the film is sort of very similar to Hereditary and has a lot of, despite coming out a year before Hereditary and them having no link whatsoever, a lot of really similar sort of plot lines and goings on, which I thought was really interesting. And as a film itself, I quite enjoyed it, because it's very well directed. It's got a really good visual sense. Everything's very well shot. There are some interesting camera movements. But crucially, I think that the thing that carries this film is that all of the acting is really good, including two child acting performances, which I thought were genuinely kind of funny and cute at points. And I think that's something that this film could have very easily been a cheap haunted house horror film. And normally haunted house supernatural type horror films are among my least favourite, because they go for very cheap scares. The stakes are completely sort of nebulous, so they just get moved around, and they often come with really weak characterization. Whereas this film, it does have some of those first problems with, in my opinion, with the stakes kind of moving and the mechanics of it not really being all that solid. And that's maybe just my own personal problem with supernatural horror films. But the core character interaction is really, really good. And I think the story does actually go in some quite interesting directions, and the direction is strong throughout. You get some great like special effects, and you get some quite effective scares along with that maybe become a bit more repetitive as the film goes on, but it's a little bit creative. And I think overall this was quite an enjoyable film.
Talking about the characterization, like you said, I think that really helps you embed in the world and like
it's an interesting family dynamic. Without spoiling anything. But it feels almost like quite a personal film to the director. That's like purely speculation. But without spoiling anything, there's this kind of plot development about the family's relation to one another that feels very sort of specific, and the way the dynamic is portrayed is sort of very believable. So it weirdly felt quite personal. I don't know.
I could see that. If that is not the case, then the director has done a fantastic job of making that such a believable kind of realistic environment for these characters to inhabit. And I really love the fact that they all kind of feel fleshed out in their own different ways. They aren't kind of carbon copies of one another, which is a very easy pitfall to have with child actors and child performances, because often their range is so limited, you kind of just get them to be scared on screen, and so you don't have that kind of variation and interesting sort of interactions with one another. And I like that because there's four kids, they kind of pair off in the sort of the elder siblings,
which is very believable.
For sure. It's a very, very natural dynamic. And I guess there are kind of events in the film that twist your understanding of those dynamics, which is really clever. I love that kind of subversion, not only of your expectations, but of the dynamics that you're being presented with, and how that kind of ties in to the tension of what other characters are going through, because there's moments of dramatic irony where certain characters' motivations shift quite dramatically, but unknown to the majority of the family. And so you have what look like really innocent interactions, what are innocent interactions to begin with, but then that develops and those interactions have a completely different meaning the midpoint of the film, at the end point of the film, but other characters take a long time to really understand that because they are seeing them in that original light. I think that's really cool.
Well, that's completely true, but I think mainly it's just like the chemistry is really good, and it feels like very lived in and authentic. Like if you've never seen an Indonesian film before, you kind of immediately get this sense of like what an Indonesian household like in this specific sort of rural area that they live in. And it has a level of detail to it that a lot of, again, just, you know, I think of like sort of maybe like the Paranormal Activity type films. A lot of those characters are just kind of like conduits for the film to make spooky stuff happen.
Exactly that.
And it's like, you know, you have the paranoid mum and the skeptical dad and the kids who are speaking to the ghosts. And it's this kind of like really predictable, repetitive dynamic that doesn't do anything. Whereas in this film, like you say, the film actually plays with the family dynamic and uses it in interesting ways, whilst also, you know, getting good performances and just creating this kind of realistic, lived-in environment.
I think coming on to the kind of horror aspects, because earlier you mentioned that there's kind of a point where it becomes repetitious. I think at this point I might go into spoiler territory. So if you are interested in this film, and I would say, you know,
it's on Shudder.
It's on Shudder, and I think, you know, preemptively before we get to our final feelings on it, I think we would recommend that you check this out if you are interested in just sort of supernatural horror in general.
It's very accessible, I'd say. I could recommend this to mostly anyone.
Exactly. So
this might even be the kind of film that might appeal slightly to non-horror fans.
Could do, because it's got that kind of mystery thriller angle to it as well. And so I mean, if you're bothered by subtitles and stuff, do give this a try anyway, because it is so accessible and you'd be missing out if you weren't. But coming on to the scares, we kind of understand through the film, we are led to believe that once the mother dies, she is haunting the family and trying to kill one of the children. But then we get the reveal that it's actually the grandma early on trying to kill one of the children. And so a lot of the stuff revolving around the grandma portion of the spooks. Initially, they're quite sinister. There's a few jump scares and things like that, but the way the scene is blocked and the cinematography of it, all of it, can make it quite effective in a kind of less cheap way than one would normally expect. But then you kind of get into like a cycle of things of like, okay, now this night's going to happen and these spooky noises are going to happen, and then the kids see something. There's one point in particular that kind of irks me, is the youngest kid who is trying to be killed. That's wrong. The kid isn't trying to be killed. The would-be victim is going around the house at night, opens one of the doors, sees like this ghostly figure through it, closes the doors, and then sort of tries to run away, gets themselves caught on like a coat hook. And they just like stay there, like running in place, like, oh God, I'm gonna get killed. And the ghost takes so long to try and like break through the doors and stuff like that. It feels like one of those, in a film that otherwise I don't think has that many cheap moments of fake jeopardy. It's that one kind of really forced moment of like, oh, this character should be dead by all rights. And you've kind of just...
Well, I'll say, I mean, I kind of disagree, because I think the film does actually get quite cheap at points, and it really does rely on jump scares. And what kind of brought that into closer focus for me is that comparison with Hereditary, because it's such a similar film. Hereditary does have jump scares, and I don't have a problem with jump scares inherently. What I have a problem with is if all the film really has to offer, in terms of its scariness at least, is jump scares, and it seems after a while that that's kind of the main trick that this film has. Whereas in Hereditary, it was actually very, when you look back on it, it's very creative, not only with its jump scares, like I think of the one in the car, and also one of my favourite ones is the one where you have the kid upstairs in his room, and then you kind of just notice in the top left corner of the screen that there's this like, figure.
God, yeah.
Like that kind of stuff, where it's like, and I remember people reacting to that in the cinema, being like, and like, you know, that kind of stuff is actually kind of clever. Whereas this film, I'm not saying it doesn't have clever scares. There are some like quite creative jump scares, but I think after a while it just kind of, it's running through the same tricks, like quicker than you'd like.
There's a midpoint in the film where you do kind of have this cycle of rinse, repeat, rinse, repeat.
And then there's this sort of later development, which I kind of appreciated for its ballsiness. Shall I go into it?
Yeah, for sure.
Where basically they kind of imply early on in the film that there's going to be zombies, and then there actually is zombies, which I thought was excellent and very cool.
Yeah.
But they kind of come out, and then they just kind of smash through 3 doors, and then they just get the fuck out.
Yeah, right.
And it's like, that felt like a bit of a missed opportunity. I feel like, because it has a great build up to this sort of final confrontation, and I feel the film kind of,
it fails to fully capitalize on what it's set up. And in some ways, as a viewer, it's satisfying because you do form like a real attachment to all these characters, and the fact that basically all of them get out safely, and you know, they sort of continue.
And there is a sequel to this film, so.
Well, a recent sequel.
Yeah.
Oh, tight. Okay, huge.
So this film does feel a little bit like half of a film, is what I'm saying.
Kind of. I mean, I guess the fact that it is linked with, you know, a previous well-loved film, that, you know, it was always building towards that, and so it kind of, it has an open-endedness even in its final moments, which and you know what?
It's very open-ended.
Very open-ended. Brief tangent. The way they do the kind of horror sting, oh, they're not really out of the woods. You thought,
it's very strange.
It's strange, I liked it because so often, like the one I always think of, I think is Sinister 2, is the cheapest version of this, where the character has gotten out of the danger, is fine, and then he's like on his laptop, closes the laptop, and Bagul is there. It's like, and you're like, oh, you got to be kidding! Like, you can't just
finish on a jump scare. That's
it's so cheap because I mean,
you've run out of ideas.
Yeah,
you're basically just admitting it.
You've run out of ideas. It's a really false way of having the people leave the cinemas, like, sort of still sort of shivering. Another tangent, a tangent off of a tangent. This reminds me of something. Do you remember in Thorpe Park, they used to do those horror maze things in Halloween? They used to do these things, and you'd go around and there'd be a bunch of actors like dressed up in zombie makeup or like killer clowns, all sorts of goofy shit, and you'd walk around and you get spooked. And what they had at the end of these things, as you were queuing up for it, they had the exit door, and so every so often, once a group had gone through, people would come running and screaming out of the exit door every single time. You'd be like, this must be the scariest thing ever. You walk round it, you go, it's just a fucking warehouse full of stupid bullshit. At the end, just before the final thing, there was a man with a fake chainsaw, but it was a real chainsaw, but it had the blade taken off. So he'd rev the shit out of it as you came through, and you'd run away because in your mind you're like, it's a chainsaw, and he's gonna fucking kill me. So the only frightening thing
sounds like the greatest job ever.
It's kind of hilarious, I guess, if you're just the guy like there
until
scaring
someone
kids.
Punches you in the face.
Yeah, true. But my point bit is that's the kind of movie-going equivalent of that. I guess what we're saying is this film doesn't kind of cheap out in that way with its ending, where it's so easily could have done.
It's more fun because it also makes you watch the credits.
Yes.
Yeah, which is.
They have a little dance. Yeah.
Yeah. Like, I just thought that was kind of neat, and it does make me want to watch the sequel.
Yeah.
Whereas, like, a lot of the time, those kind of like fake out endings, I'm like,
but it doesn't feel like it has any story relevance.
Yes, exactly. Whereas, I guess it's a blessing and a curse. It does make me want to watch the next film. However, as a complete experience, I don't think this film is quite the whole package.
Perhaps, but I feel like structurally, I'm not sure I fully agree, because I think it does an excellent job in terms of revealing more and more information throughout, kind of switching gears on you. Because I love the fact that it's a mystery is kind of solved and then there is a new mystery. So the initial mystery being, why are we being haunted? And the death of the grandma, which does happen after the mother dies. The grandma appears to be controlling one of the children, the second youngest, to kill the youngest, and we as the audience don't fully understand why that is, but we've kind of been given 2 layers of information, one that pertains to the finale of the film and one that pertains to the current events, but we don't know that yet. So there's stuff about the curse that the mother has brought upon them. Satan's slaves, there's this kind of cult thing going on. The children were created as a means to appease the devil. And so initially you're led to believe, oh, the mother is controlling the kid to kill the final child, when actually it's the grandma trying to kill the final child because that child is fucking evil. Yeah. That's the evil one. And I love, so you have this kind of revelation, and then the ending part of the film, your third act, feels really fresh to me because it's like a whole new set of circumstances that you're unpacking. The cult shows up, the zombies show up, you're fighting a whole new enemy, your understanding of all the events. But then the problem is the film
just kind of peters out once it hits that point.
Okay, that's fair, but I feel like the structure and story are there, but maybe it just doesn't stick the landing, if you know what I mean. But I wouldn't necessarily say it feels like half of a film. More so...
it's a film with a lot of unresolved threads, which is fine, but I don't know. I just felt like that, plus the lack of a true climax for me, kind of left it feeling a bit like part one.
I can see that, but a part one perhaps, yes. Yes, okay. Less so half of the film, but more, the beginning.
I still like the film overall. That's just probably my biggest criticism of it. That, and I think that some of the scares could be more creative, especially because the best sort of moment in the film in terms of horror is the guy who just gets randomly run over on his bicycle.
That was brutal.
Which was excellent.
So unexpected. Probably the one moment of real gore throughout. It really went ham with it.
It's literally like a 5-second scene of a guy getting run over, but the film puts so much effort into how good it looks. It's kind of
I love
wow,
that.
I wish we had more of that kind of like Final Destination or, Hereditary stuff. So
Well, again, it feels like the car accident in Hereditary, which is weird because as far as I can tell, there is no linking.
There's no link.
These films at all.
These films are very similar.
Yeah, and there's just one of those weird coincidences. You occasionally do get that. I mean, talking about some of the jump scares, focusing on some of the highlights of those, I love the moment where the two youngest kids are in the corridor. They've gotten up in the night to go to the loo, and they come back, and there's nothing in this corridor, but they just kind of stop and stare. They get some kind of sensation, and it's unclear how they have this sensation, but they get a blanket and they walk up to a picture of their now deceased mother, and they chuck it, and it covers the silhouette of what would be there. And I loved that. I just thought that was really creative and did kind of take my breath away. I've mentioned this before in previous reviews. I love the unseen being in shot, and it's a slightly different version of that because it's completely transparent, completely invisible, but the knowledge that frightening thing was always there, I just think kind of triggers something like some deep primordial part of my ape brain. So I found that one to be particularly affecting.
Yeah. I mean, that's a great moment. Yeah, I feel like I have seen that in a film before. I can't think of what it is.
I probably have. It seems like a familiar thing, but this film did it very well.
Yeah, no, it's a good scene. I just can't think of what it is.
I also liked something they do early on with the sounds of like bells ringing, because there's like the bedside bell that the mother used to use, and then she's dead, and then it becomes this kind of
signal that some bad shit's gonna happen. Yeah,
it kind of becomes tied to her presence in the house. I think one of the first times she comes into the room after she hears the bell is just hovering in the air and drops to the floor. And again, what I kind of liked about that, even though I'm sure they do a horror sting immediately afterwards, the fact that it's just there, it's not like some kind of secret thing that's being hidden from the character and the audience, which would be the easier sort of tropier way of doing things. It's there, and then it snaps out. And also the fact that another thing I love is when all of the characters in a film are just completely on board with what's going on.
Yeah, there's not much doubt. Yeah.
We recently watched Nope, and aside from being a very entertaining film, they instantly just go along with the fact, oh yeah, there's a UFO up there. Yeah. And like all the characters like, yeah, that sounds about right. And I love that because it kind of removes a lot of this very template storytelling style of, oh, we have to go through these very set procedural steps of getting our characters to understand what's really happening. But if the characters are just fully on board with an idea, it gives so much more room to develop the situational horror, which I think this film does a really good job of.
Yeah, no, I mean, I completely agree. I'm glad the film doesn't use sort of boring shortcuts like that. It's genuinely quite well written, which it's just sad to say, most horror films just aren't well written.
No.
And this film is like each character has their own like you get an actual sense of who they are. It gives you like a bit of mystery and intrigue, but it really doesn't like waste your time with boring horror template trope stuff that you've seen a million times before.
Right.
Especially in haunted house films, which seem to so easily fall victim to that. So yeah, that's definitely a big plus for this film.
Okay, Rupert. So what do you reckon you'll rate this film?
I would rate it a 6 at the moment, but it's like a strong 6 that like if I saw the sequel and really liked it, I could see myself kind of like with that context maybe increasing the rating.
Right.
But as like a single standalone piece, I think like a 6, like it's an above average good horror film.
I'd go one further. I think I'd give it a 7. I think this is just a very entertaining example of this kind of subgenre. And the setting, the locale of Indonesia, and all the creative minds being from there, like it kind of added a new layer to something otherwise very familiar. And even though it did feel very modern and kind of Western in some of its presentation elements, the family dynamic was fantastic. The kind of specific details about the kind of underpinning horror going on, the visuals of the mother, as she appears in her sort of ghostly form, reminded me of Kwaidan quite a lot. Particularly the Lady in the Snow section of that film. I know that's Japanese, but still, there's a kind of like cultural crossover in that representation of the supernatural, at least from what I can tell. And yeah, I would highly recommend this to anyone that loves supernatural horror films. It just had like a really nice, specific charm and personality to it that I could only get from this film.
I do agree with that. Yeah.
And that made it a really rewarding experience for me. So that is about all from us. Thank you very much for watching. If you have enjoyed this video and you agree and you've seen Satan's Slaves and you liked it as well, please give it a like and consider subscribing to the channel. And if you dislike this video, give it a dislike. Thank you very much for watching. We'll catch you again next time. We've got plenty more Hooptober horror content coming in the coming days and weeks. We hope to see you there. Peace.
Peace.